Hey guys, what's up? My name's Jerichus, and I'm here today to bring you my first ever video guide. And today is going to be all about Brackenhide Hollow. So Brackenhide Hollow is a dungeon in the Season 2 rotation for Dragonflight. And my goal today is by the end of the video, you're going to be ready to tackle all the crazy mobs with the spells you got to interrupt, the spells you got to dodge, what you got to do. And then I'm also going to help you out with some specific boss mechanics. And of course, all of this is in the context of the Warlock class, because Warlock's the class I play, and that's the kind of guides that I plan to bring to you guys. So I hope you guys enjoy, and let's go ahead and get started. As you start off the dungeon, in Brackenhide Hollow, you're going to make your way to the first boss, which is Hackclaw's Warband. On your way there, there'll be a whole bunch of different packs of mobs, and 3 specific mobs I want to draw your attention to. The first of which is the Claw Fighter. Claw Fighter is a big problem because it will cast a move called Vicious Claw Mangle. And Vicious Claw Mangle will cause it to target a specific player in the party, and it will fixate on them and chase them down. If it catches up to you, it's going to hit you and do a tremendous amount of damage, possibly 1 to 2 shotting you. A couple of different ways as a Warlock that we can handle this. My favorite is Mortal Coil. Mortal Coil is a quick spell. Throw it right at that mob, and it'll break that fixate and keep you safe. Additionally, you can consider fearing it, and if all else fails, just make sure you run. The second mob to discuss is the Bracken War Scourge. Bracken War Scourge is a problem because it buffs all the other nearby gnolls in its vicinity. Additionally, it has a really nasty AoE fear called Hideous Cackle. After it does this move, if it gets off, it's going to fear all members of the party in a random direction. If that happens, this part of the dungeon is incredibly packed with mobs, and it's highly likely you're going to pull something else and cause a problem. However, there is a way to predict when this will be cast. Every time that you see the Bracken War Scourge spinning around doing its whirlwind attack, be ready, because once it stops, it's going to go immediately into a Hideous Cackle, and that's where you want to be ready to cast your interrupt. Last up for this area of the dungeon is the Decay Speaker. Reason Decay Speaker is such a problem is that it'll buff another mob called the Mystics in this area with its Rot Chanting Totem. If that goes down, you have a couple of things you can do. You can focus down the totem to get rid of it, or just make sure that there's no other Mystics around to get buffed. Additionally, it casts a high single target spell called Decay Surge. This is something that can be interrupted, and you're encouraged to do so, because if it hits a player in your party, it's going to apply a really nasty dot effect in addition to that high single target damage, and can really rapidly lead to a wipe. All right, you've made it this far, and it's time to face off against the first boss encounter of this dungeon. And that's going to be a nasty trio of gnolls known as Hackclaw's Warband. This boss encounter consists of 3 individual bosses. You have Gashtooth, who's a rogue, Crick Totem, which is the healer of the group, and Hackclaw herself, the warrior. First, we're going to go into the major mechanics of the fight. So shortly into the fight, Gashtooth is going to shadow step to every player in the party and inflict a heavy bleed dot effect. This dot is permanent, and it will also stack if you don't clear it. The good news is that if you can get yourself above 90% health, either through healing or other means, then you will be able to automatically remove that dot completely and negate that major damage effect. You can expect to see this happen about 2 to 3 times during the fight. It's always important to discuss with your healer how they want to handle this, but if you forget to discuss it with them, or you're just with a general pug group that isn't really chatty, a good way to deal with it is to have both a health stone, as a warlock you should have those, and also a healing potion at the ready. So as soon as you're targeted and you see the first chunk of damage be inflicted, use one of those 2, and it will get you above 90% and remove the dot completely. Your healer will definitely thank you. The second major attack that Gashtooth will do is he will mark a target with something called Marked for Butchery. Ultimately, this is a situation where he will chase around that player that is marked, inflicting heavy damage for about 4 seconds. If you're targeted, I really like to go ahead and use a demonic circle or demonic gateway that I've set up before the encounter begins in order to negate that. If I can't get away, this is an excellent time to consider using a heavy defensive such as Dark Pact or Unending Resolve to mitigate some of that damage. Trick Totem, being the healer or caster of the group, will be healing periodically her allies. And the way in which they do that is through a spell called Greater Healing Rapids. This is something you definitely want to interrupt, because if you don't, it's going to lead to a lot of additional healing on the bosses, prolonging the fight, leading to more casts of those dangerous mechanics we've been discussing. The other major mechanic that Trick Totem will do is the summoning of a Hex Trick Totem. Hex Trick Totem is a stop what you're doing and immediately focus type mechanic. This totem will hex the healer, making them completely unable to do anything until the totem is destroyed. So make sure that as soon as it spawns, you switch target and get that thing down as soon as possible. Last up is Hackclaw herself. So Hackclaw does a couple of different moves, the first of which is a whirlwind mechanic in which she will spin in circles while fixating random members of the party. If you're selected, she'll slowly start whirlwinding towards you, and all you have to do is stay out of that whirlwind circle. Again, as a Warlock, you have a tremendous amount of ways to deal with this. You can circle, you can gateway, you can use Burning Rush, anything to create some distance between you and that boss. Additionally, Hackclaw will periodically select a random party member and line up a major charge attack. You'll know that you're chosen because Hackclaw will turn, face at you, and there will be a big red arrow on the floor pointing directly towards you. If you're selected, what you need to do is stand still and don't move. And that can be counterintuitive. I see a lot of players want to go running around and trying to get out of it, but she will continue to fixate on you, and there's no way that you can move out of the way. Instead, if you stand still, that'll give an opportunity for the tank to get between you and the boss and absorb that damage. If it's done correctly, you won't take any damage at all. After the Hackclaw Warband, most groups are going to start making their way towards Treemouth, the second boss of the dungeon. Fortunately for us, there aren't a tremendous amount of new mobs to concern ourselves with, but there are a couple that I want to bring to your attention. The first of which is the Wilted Oak. These guys are pretty hard to miss. They're large lumbering treants, and they scattered throughout this part of the dungeon. The reason they're so important is they have a really nasty frontal cone AoE attack that absolutely must be interrupted, and it's called Necrotic Breath. If that goes off, your party's going to take a lot of damage, somebody's probably going to die, and this can lead to a wipe. So make sure you focus down that cast. The second mob to focus on is the Infected Lasher. These guys are small, they tend to travel in large packs, and there's a couple of mobs, including the Wilted Oak, which can summon them. In and of themselves, they're weak, and you'll probably just AoE them down, but if your tank is having a hard time getting aggro on them, as a Warlock, you may find some of these guys coming your way, since you're doing a lot of AoE damage. If they get on you, they'll start to apply a stacking bleeding dot, and 1 or 2 stacks is not a problem, but as you start to get more and more, you'll start taking a lot of heavy damage, and you may find that it'll overwhelm your health, and you may end up dying as a result. So just be aware of those, and you may have to calm down your AoE if your tank's having a hard time wrangling them together. Treemouth is the second boss of this dungeon, and fortunately for us, is a lot more mechanically simple than Hackclaw's Warband. Basically, there's only 3 major mechanics that you need to understand as a Warlock player in order to get this boss down. The first of which is called Vine Whip. So periodically, Treemouth will do a large frontal cone towards the tank. Your job is just not to be in that cone. It doesn't really have a telegraph, and it happens pretty quickly, so my advice is to stay away from the front of the boss and stay away from where the tank is standing so that you can avoid this mechanic. The second attack that you need to be aware of is called Decay Spray. The boss will periodically pick a party member, and that party member will have an indicator over their head that they're going to be the target of the move called Decay Spray. After a period of time, the boss will then spray out ooze towards that player, and 4 small puddles will appear wherever the player was standing. From there, small oozes will spawn at that location. It's really important that you try to be near the boss when these go off, so that the small little oozes will be close to the boss and it makes it really easy to AoE cleave them down. Those small oozes will periodically cast a AoE spell, and so it's important that they be crowd controlled and stunned while they're being rapidly bursted down. Remember that as a Warlock, you do have access to Dark Fury if you've talented into it, and that's an excellent way to get a big AoE stun on that pack of oozes. Additionally, Seed of Corruption, as well as Doom Blossom, will make very short work of them, and so usually they'll die pretty quickly as long as you're focusing them down. The last mechanic to be aware of is called Consume. The boss will root itself in place with a small circle AoE around it and start sucking all players in towards its location. Typically, as a DPS player in Warlock, you just want to stay away from the boss at this point and continue to run away. You can use your Demonic Circle, you can use a Gateway if you really want to, but it's not such a fast pull that you can't just run away from it. However, one player does have to be consumed. If not, the boss is going to get a huge enrage effect, and that's permanent and will likely lead to a wipe. Typically, the tank will do this each time, and then as a DPS player, all you have to do is stay out of it, and then break the shield after the tank is consumed. Every now and again, the tank won't be comfortable taking 2 consumes, because it is true that consume does leave a debuff on the player that's consumed, making them take increased damage on any subsequent consumes that they do in a row. And so every now and again, they'll want you as the Warlock to do it, because you're a pretty tanky DPS. If that's the case, make sure you discuss it beforehand. You can use things such as Unending Resolve and Dark Pact to make it easier for you to survive while you're waiting to be broken out. Other than that, it's just a matter of DPSing down the boss, and you'll be ready to move on to the next encounter. With Treemouth out of the way, it's time for your group to head up and fight the 3rd boss of the dungeon, Gutshot. Before you get there, though, you're going to have to contend with a little bit more trash, although most groups are going to skip most of the trash on the way to the 3rd boss. The first mob you're going to encounter right after you leave Treemouth's arena is a mob called Stink Breath. Stink Breath is a mini-boss of this dungeon. Has more health than average and a couple of moves that can be more of a pain for groups. There is a gateway tactic that some groups will choose to use to skip Stink Breath, and I'll highlight that later in the video for how you can complete that. If your group does choose to fight Stink Breath, there's going to be 2 major moves to contend with. For melee, they have to avoid Violent Whirlwind. Standard Whirlwind attack, just get out of it when it's being cast and you'll be fine. As a Warlock, usually we don't have to deal with that. The second move is called Stink Breath. Random party member will be targeted, and a frontal cone will attack that player, dealing damage and stunning them. A trick that you can use to avoid this altogether is stand at max casting range. If you do, even if you're selected with Stink Breath, it can't reach you. And basically, you can just ignore that mechanic, assuming that you're at max casting range. After you've either skipped or contended with Stink Breath, you'll make your way towards Gutshot's arena. And to do that, you end up passing by a very large pack of mobs, which includes a Rotbow Stalker, as well as a bunch of animal-type mobs, like hyenas. Most groups are going to skip this. However, if your group chooses to tackle it, I do want to comment briefly on the Rotbow Stalker. The Rotbow Stalker has to be a priority target. It will buff the surrounding animals. It will also do a tremendous amount of damage itself, and so you want to get that down as soon as possible. If it's left up for a while, you're likely going to wipe, and that's why most people and most groups will choose to just avoid this pack altogether. After that, you'll make your way up, and it's time to fight the 3rd boss. Gutshot is the 3rd boss during this dungeon, and overall is relatively simple. The way that it's set up is that you have the boss accompanied by 2 hyenas. Throughout the fight, the boss will continue to spawn additional hyenas. The boss will primarily focus on the tank, and intermittently will throw traps at random players. The players just need to dodge those AoE swirlies on the ground in order to avoid taking damage and being ensnared. However, those same traps are going to be really important for the next major mechanic that we'll discuss. So as was stated, the boss has hyenas alongside it during the fight and periodically is summoning more. Occasionally the boss will select a player and throw meat at them. That meat will create a debuff that makes them the primary focus target for the hyenas, who are now fixated on that player and will chase them around the arena. Fortunately, as we discussed, there are traps that are scattered around. And so if you're able, you can kite one of those hyenas through a trap. That'll snare it and allow you to continue to make more room for yourself to avoid getting hit. There is one complicating factor, and that's Gutshot's third major ability, called Master's Call. This is an interruptible cast, and this is your primary interrupt target throughout the fight. If that goes off, it will make all of the hyenas immune to ensnares, and will also give them increased speed. That in and of itself is likely going to cause the death of the person who's being chased down by the hyenas. And so even though it's a mechanically simple fight, you can see that with a couple of missed kicks or a couple of poorly placed traps, or if you end up using your traps too early, it can really start to spiral out of control and you can have a hard time. So overall, as a Warlock, I would encourage you to put down your circle and put down your gate in order to give yourself as well as your party members some additional options for mobility. You want to make sure that you're focusing down those hyenas and getting them killed before the next set spawns, because if not, they're going to start to stack and it'll become overwhelming. And then lastly, make sure that you're interrupting Master's Call as an absolute priority. We've got 3 bosses down, and there's one more to go. Located in the Den of Decay, the final part of the dungeon, is Decatriarch Wratheye. And this is the final boss that stands between you and completing this dungeon. There's 2 new mobs that we need to discuss that are part of the trash packs leading up to that boss. The first and most important is the Feated Rotsinger. What makes this mob so important is that it has a similar aura to the War Scourge that you encountered at the first part of the dungeon, meaning that it empowers nearby gnolls and nearby mobs, making the overall pack much more powerful just due to its presence. Additionally, it spawns a Decay Totem, a really dangerous totem that stacks inflicting nature damage as well as decreased movement speed over time. And so whenever the Decay Totem goes down, the whole group needs to swap and make sure that that gets killed as soon as possible. Lastly, it has a major AoE damage attack called Burst of Decay that is interruptible, and so make sure that you focus down that interrupt. The second mob to discuss is the Vile Rothhexer, another really dangerous mob. What it does is casts a spell called Withering Contagion on a random party member. What this does is it decreases the damage of that party member by 20% and additionally causes stacking nature damage. On top of that, there's a small circle about 5 yards in distance that surrounds the player, and anybody else that steps into that effect will then have the same Withering Contagion on them as well. To make matters worse, after casting Withering Contagion, the Vile Rothhexer will try to siphon that off with a spell called Siphon Decay. It will take the disease away from the player, but it will empower the Rothhexer. And that's a major problem because the Rothhexer can get really powerful if a whole bunch of players have the Withering Contagion on them at once. You can mitigate that by standing at least 30 yards away from the Vile Rothhexer when that cast goes off. If you're at least 30 yards away, it can't siphon it off, and it gives your healer more time to dispel off that disease. And now we've made it to the fourth and final boss, Decatriarch Wratheye. This fight, mechanically for a Warlock, is extremely simple. It's a circular loop where the boss will cast a poison cloud. That poison cloud will move around circularly in a room in the same pattern as it always does, and your job's just to stay out of it. Additionally, the boss will periodically spawn totems, and those totems are a #1 priority. You must swap to the totem as soon as possible, and your goal is to prevent it from ever casting. If it is able to cast, it will apply a stacking dot, which over time will also empower the boss, and that's how this fight gets out of control. Lastly, as the boss reaches 100 energy, she will cast Decaying Strength. It will empower the boss while simultaneously causing an AoE eruption around the players. And so the players want to make sure that they have spread out in order to mitigate any additional damage. During that cast, it's a reasonable time to cast a large defensive, such as Unending Resolve or Dark Pact. In fact, you can usually have Dark Pact up for every cast of Decaying Strength, which will help mitigate a fair amount of damage for your healer. But overall, it's just a rinse and repeat. Kill the totems, make them your priority, stay out of the poison cloud, and make sure to pop some defensives when the Decaying Strength AoE is going out from the boss. There's really only one major gateway skip that's used during Brackenhide Hollow, and it's after the second boss, Treemouth. It's used to skip Stink Breath. That's the lieutenant mob or mini boss that we talked about that a lot of groups will end up fighting. And so the way that you complete this skip is after the boss, you run up to the little outcropping there and you try to aim your gateway as far down the bridge as you possibly can. And then you allow Stink Breath to continue to walk down the bridge away from the gateway. And what you'll see here is my party member is going to go too soon. And that's going to end up causing the pull. But if they had waited, you'd be able to skip right past him. He won't pull and you'd be okay. A much smaller, but another opportunity where you can use your gate is just after the Stink Breath encounter. As you're making your way up to the third boss, there's a small little cliff that you have to get up over, and you can run up it on your mount, but a lot of people have a hard time with it, so I'll sometimes put up a little tiny baby gate there just to help people get up the hill, and it makes it a lot easier. Remember, though, you can't do both, because if you ended up doing the Stink Breath skip with your gateway, then it'll be on cooldown, and you won't be able to use it for this little hill. But again, the little hill's not necessary, but it's an option there if you want to consider it. So regarding spec and talent choice that I recommend for this dungeon, I think all three specs have a strong contender in terms of being able to output some really strong DPS in this dungeon. That being said, I favor Affliction. I think on Warcraft logs, you're mostly going to see a Wall of Destruction, as that's the most popular spec and can also perform really well in this setting. But I think Affliction's also starting to become a big contender, especially with the buff to Doom Blossom. And so I want to go over some of the specific talents that I think are really important and for your consideration when you're trying to decide what spec to run. So in terms of utility from the class tree, I think Burning Rush with the additional buff is extremely powerful in terms of mobility, giving you on-demand burst of speed to get away from certain mechanics at the cost of really low damage that it gives you. I think Gateway is a must. It gives additional utility to you and your party members. I think Shadow Fury is also extremely important to have. It gives you an on-demand AoE stun so that you can stop certain mechanics that can't be interrupted. And it's a really helpful addition to just crowd control in terms of what you bring to the group. And then lastly, Dark Pact. Dark Pact is just overpowered. You're able to mitigate so much damage using it, and so I'm pretty liberal with how I end up using it. And I've also chosen the talent that reduces its cooldown, so I just think it's a really powerful move. Regarding the class tree, I went all in on AoE for this dungeon. I think that adding Sow the Seeds, coupled with Doom Blossom and coupled with Grim Reach, gives you a really powerful AoE profile that you can also add on the fact that 3 out of the 4 bosses can also favor a heavy AoE profile as well. And so all put together, I think Affliction is in a really good place. I just think it's a really fun spec that we don't get to play all that much in all the content if you're really trying to push hard. And so I think in this case, it really does shine. And so that's where I would recommend going forward. All right, guys, that'll do it. We've made it to the end of the guide. I really hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it. So, as I said before, this is my first ever guide, so certainly open to criticism, looking to improve, looking to make something helpful for the community, especially going into Season 3 just around the corner. I'm a Warlock main, so most of my content is going to be directed at the Warlock community, but that being said, I'm open to making other types of content as well. So please, if you guys enjoyed it, please give it a like, give it a subscribe, maybe leave a comment. That really helps a lot. You can also catch me on Twitch or Twitter if you want to connect, talk Warlock stuff, all that good. So again, guys, really enjoyed it. Hope to see you guys around.